Our speaker today is Tom Moore, who was also on our series last year. Tom studied music at Harvard and Stanford and librarianship at Simmons. He's been a music librarian at Princeton College in New Jersey, and presently is head of the Sound and Image Department at Florida International University in beautiful, sunny Miami. As well as contributing articles and reviews to a plethora of publications. Tom has performed professionally as a bass with Concert Royale and Pomerium, and as a flutist with Le Triomphe de l'Amour, Philomel, and Mélomanie, including 3 successive years premiering new works with the Ronai Moore Duo in the Composers Ensemble at Princeton series. I'll turn off that email. His talk today, Grétry Philosopher, reflects the work he's doing currently on the opera composer André Grétry's late collection of writings, Reflections of a Solitary Man. So please welcome Tom Moore.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get back to my slides here. Okay. So, this first image we have is, it looks like it could be, I guess it is, he has pedals, so he's actually, I suppose, composing music, but it's hard to say from the image there. This is from quite far on in his career. So, we heard a little bit of Grétry before we got started today, and I suppose he's one of the most successful and least known composers of the 18th century. And we were talking about that informally before we started. Why is that? He was active in Paris, and he was extremely successful starting around 1760, and continued to write comic operas primarily until about 1800. And he collaborated with some of the leading literary figures in Paris, but the output is almost entirely comic opera. And he does not have any significant production of instrumental music. There's a set of string quartets, an early set of string quartets. But unlike so many of the other composers, he's not known for his instrumental music. So these 2 pictures, you can see that he's specifically depicted as writing music, not playing music. He got to the time of the French Revolution and had been a intimate associate of the royal family, Marie Antoinette in particular, and his comic operas are related to the social scene in Paris. If we think about what operas are for, what the social work is that the operas do, they help the people who are listening to the operas, watching the operas, think about how they behave in their social context. So, in Italy, we think about the tragic opera, the opera seria. That is the most prestigious musical phenomenon in Italy, and we still have this image of it ain't over until the fat lady sings, that the greatest of operas are the ones in which the soprano goes mad and dies, leaps off a balcony, takes poison, dies from consumption. And France being a much more wealthy country than Italy, we have a situation where there is a social mobility from the class of Grétry, for example, into the class, the next class above it, which was the literary class. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And eventually into the aristocratic class. And the best way of getting from the lowest class to the highest class is to marry upwards, to make a good marriage. If we think about the Beaumarchais comic operas, they're known to us from the Mozart settings of this type of opera. But Beaumarchais actually produced these in Paris with other music, simpler music, and we see somebody like Rosina who moves from a lower class up to being a countess. So Grétry tells us in his philosophy later that a woman who has wit and beauty can use this as social capital. It can substitute for actual physical capital, for money, or for the capital of having been born into an aristocratic family. So Grétry spends his career as a composer of comic opera, depicting the nuances of all these characters who are moving socially, who are mobile socially. This is comic. Somebody who has more pretensions than they can claim to, that's comic. Somebody who has low pretensions and can move up to higher pretensions, that's also a comic situation. If we think of another Mozart opera where this doesn't happen, Zauberflöte, we have the gods, essentially, then we have the nobility, and then we have the working class. They don't mix. They function on different levels. But what Grétry is doing when he's writing his comic operas is depicting musically the nuances of the character of these people who have various character traits. And that is his focus. His focus is not on creating musical structures. He's depicting character. So it makes a great deal of sense that when he gets to the 1790s, in which the comic opera of social transformation is no longer relevant because we've had the revolution, everybody's a citizen now, the aristocracy has taken their money and fled, the bishops no longer have their monasteries with all the income that those have attached. So he no longer has a market for his operas. And so he takes all the philosophical thinking that he had been doing in creating these operas over 30 years and starts to be a philosopher. Who was Grétry? He was a musician from a musical family, which meant that he was definitely not from an upper class family. He was successful enough as a composer in his very early life that he was sent to Rome to study at a college in Rome, made good connections in Rome, started writing operas, goes through Geneva and back to Paris. So he was extremely successful with operas premiering and being repeated. This Caravan of Cairo was, I think, was staged almost 500 times. There was at least 500 performances, something like that. Both before the French Revolution and after Napoleon becomes emperor. So he produced this first volume of memoirs or essays on music, and it was published just as one volume in 1789. The very first part of it, the first 150 pages, is sort of a biography of how I got to Rome and then to Geneva and how I came back to Paris. But once he gets back to Paris, he doesn't talk about his personal life anymore. He's focusing specifically on all of the operas. So he has a catalog of the operas. He talks about when they were first performed, the details of the operas. It stops being a biography. And as you can see, it says, Monsieur Grétry, royal composer, intimate counselor of His Highness the Monseigneur the Bishop, Prince of Liège, member of the Academy of the Philharmonica of Bologna, a very famous learned academy. At any rate, the people he's pointing to are people who are from the aristocracy and the clergy. Makes sense in 1789. This volume only goes as far as 1786. So I'm sure he wasn't aware that the revolution was going to happen at the year that the book came out. The fact that he was the personal musician of Marie Antoinette, and he goes on to be a diehard Republican, shows perhaps either a notable political skill or a certain hypocrisy, shall we say. At any rate, he goes from being a diehard royalist to being a Republican in a very short time. And the title page of the second edition lists him as Citizen Grétry. He's a member of the National Institute and inspector of the Conservatory of Music. So these are both institutions which represent Republican France. The monarchy is gone, long live the Republic. And he doesn't expand volume 1. It's in fact some of the things it had, the alphabetical index, table of contents are not there. There aren't any more further works after 1786 that are discussed. And the second and third volumes, which are about the size of the first volume, are all philosophical questions already. So there's the title page of the second edition. Citoyen Grétry, member of the National Institute. And almost immediately there was a translation into German by Mr. Karl Spazier, and it says, with critical and historical views by Mr. Spazier. So not only does it take the material from Grétry's autobiography, but it also includes criticism by Spazier. So, the memoirs. This is, as to emphasize, this is his first literary work. So this to give you an idea of what is in the contents of the volumes 2 and 3. Love, jealousy, how foreigners behave, foreign accents, religions. Are great talents always accompanied by good morals? We're still dealing with that question. On fashion, on the unknown limits of everything. That's getting kind of philosophical. Sensitivity, all sorts of things that he would have thought about in his operas. So he says, this is interesting. I've only written these reflections on music in order to relax from my usual labor, that is writing from artist, composer to a literary man. We saw that the previous volume said, I am not a literary man. But now he's saying, I've written 50 operas, and I don't want to have people thinking that I can't do anything else, but I'm not interested in contemporary opera. It's moved on, it's become tragedy, mayhew, that kind of opera, and he says, the number of works that have come from my pen have made me experience ideas that are more determinate than those of the musician. In other words, while I was writing these notes in order to take these characters, I thought about the details of character, of philosophy, and I need to write them down. He still goes on to say, I'm not a literary figure, but I have an erudition of sensations. All the sensations he had stocked up over 30 years as a composer are in there, and he wants to write about them and express his memory of the sentiments. And he says they are important enough that they can dispute with the facts that one finds in books. So, de la vérité, what we were, what we are, what we ought to be. 1801. He publishes this, and he has retired already to a country estate which he had purchased, and it was where Rousseau lived. And he spends the rest of his life writing more than 400,000 words of philosophy. Most of the manuscript survives, not all of it. It's written out on these pieces of paper and in ink, and it's not so easily legible. We're told, I think it's in Fétis, yes, that he had plans to publish it almost immediately in 1811. When he was working on volume 6, it ends up being 8 volumes, I think. And he dies in 1813, and it never went to press. Luckily, most of it has survived. People were aware of this in the 19th century. People would go and visit the family and read some of the volumes. But we're very lucky that it survived into the 20th century and was published in a large edition in the early 20s, supported by the Belgian government. About 450,000 words. There's some things that have come to light since then that have been published, and I think there are even a few things that weren't even included in the 1993 edition. so here we get an idea of all the writers that he cites: Alcibiades, Ariosto, Beaumarchais, Condillac is very present, Plutarch's Lives, Racine, Raphael, Montaigne. He very consciously thinks of himself as a continuer of the tradition of Montaigne, who was already 200 years before he was working. Somebody who was writing from his own experience, writing about what he discovered for himself. I would say it's primarily Montaigne, and I think maybe on the bottom of the page we have Rousseau. Rousseau is the other major figure. And again, he made the gesture of buying the hermitage that Rousseau had lived in. So for him, Rousseau was extremely important. In fact, the title for this work makes a reference to the last work of Rousseau. This is quite surprising, the number of English writers we find. Franklin, who of course was in Paris, doesn't mention Jefferson, however. Milton, Newton, Shakespeare, and almost no German writers. The culture went only one way. Culture went outwards from Paris into Germany, and it didn't come back. So just to remind us of Montaigne, the major work of Montaigne is these essays, but he also has a very interesting travel journal. And it's these reveries of a solitary walker that are clearly the model for the reflections of a solitaire that Grétry produces. Condillac, a speculative philosopher from a couple of generations before Grétry, not very well known today. Some of the other contemporary composer writers that we find are Reichardt. He's reasonably well known today, I think. He's not certainly unknown, but exactly like Grétry, his writings have not impacted modern musical thinking. They're not quoted, they're not printed, they're not translated. We have all these intimate letters from France, intimate letters from Paris, intimate letters from Vienna. There's even an autobiography, although it was published in episodes in the AMZ. None of these have been translated into draw from their reflections. Talks about the music of the Greeks, the need for harmony between the emotions and the cognition, heart and the head. Is it better to have both vice and virtue than to have all vice and all virtue? This is clearly a question for an opera. On the danger of novels. So just to give you a sense of what his writing is like. He enters an enchanted palace. A gigantic figure, a magician, takes me by the hand, leads me to a charming boudoir. A woman of ravishing beauty was there lying on a sofa. She stands up, bows to me in the most noble manner, approaches me, gives me a kiss, and disappears. The magician takes my hand and leads me to a neighboring room. There on a table are 3 baskets. In it, I see shreds of human flesh and hair, and the next bloody entrails, and the third human bones and a skull on top. What a frightful spectacle. This is her as well. I suppose he might have learned that at the Masonic Lodge, although that's just a speculation. Considerable biographical material on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Guy Devaux. Dell was a very interesting figure. He's one of the librettists for Grétry. He was originally from Ireland, if I'm not mistaken. A discussion of the difference between Voltaire and Jean-Jacques. Those that we call good marriages are often the bad ones. That's also very contemporary. That's one of the wonderful things about this work is you can't believe that he was writing these things 200 years ago. It's a revolutionary period, but for him to be writing things that are so forward-looking is just astounding. There's a considerable amount about sexual politics in the work, and specifically talking about Parisian society, of course, about the conflict between women from the demi-monde and honest women. That's the word that he uses at the opera. The honest women are there with their husbands, and the women from the demi-monde there are there perhaps to go hunting for men. We need to analyze our sentiments in order to really understand them. We can't just feel them. We need to analyze how they function. In our theater, in our novels, do we depict virtue or vice? And what kind of man is the man who must hate woman? That's another extremely modern point of view. Can one be great in one thing and little and stupid in all the rest? We certainly know plenty of people who are like that. So, thinking about this last bit of Grétry's philosophy in general, when I was first reading these, some of them are 25,000 words long, some of them are 5,000, some are 3,000. They don't fall into a mold. He didn't have to fulfill a market need. He could write whatever he felt like writing, and so they're quite refreshing. In a certain sense, it feels like a blog. A blog with 3 to 25,000 word postings. And it was just at this very time that the feuilleton starts to be a literary genre in France. It's not something we think about much these days. Art Buchwald, if you remember Art Buchwald, that was kind of a feuilleton. There is a great writer in Brazil, Verissimo, who writes feuilleton, but they're not so popular in the United States. Some of the very greatest writers of the last 2 centuries were people who did the genre, including Machado de Assis from Brazil, Neruda from Bohemia, Čapek from Bohemia, being somebody who's a serious philosopher and doesn't do anything else. Clearly, in order to write 450,000 words over 10 years, it's something you do every day and take very seriously. As I said, Masonry is not explicitly present, but if you know where to look, it seems like it's very influential. And his interest in scientific research. If I read about conversations with Beethoven, I think it's not possible that Beethoven, or for that matter, almost any other musical figure from this time, would have this level of interest in a broad philosophical world, including physics, science, psychology, sexual politics, and to have the level of broad reading that he has. I can only think that we have a sort of disregard for France as someplace that's not quite serious, which is why perhaps we haven't looked at this material before. It's extremely revealing about both the composer and his period. And not only that, but it's really enjoyable reading. And at that point, I will ask you for your questions. Thank you.
Well, I assume he was, this last stage, he wasn't a professional writer. That is, was he making money with this, or was he doing it as a retirement thing?
Oh, he was very wealthy. He had made plenty of money. He had a government fellowship. What's the word I want? He had a pension, a substantial pension. So he was not in any need of money. On the other hand, the fact that he published the first edition of the memoirs in 1789, published a second edition which was with government support, apparently, and then published another book. And these are not small books, they're substantial books. Each of the first ones would be probably 400 or 500 pages. And this last work, maybe 1,000 pages, if we print it in a normal edition. So, yes, he's not professional in the sense that he's doing it for money. But I know that Dr. Johnson, only a fool would ever write if it weren't for money. But in this case, I'm using the word professional in the sense that his major activity had been composition. His major activity clearly moves from being composition to writing. I don't know how many copies these sold, but they certainly were published in a large edition because it's not so difficult to find them in antiquarian bookshops. You could buy a copy of one of the first two for probably $400 or $500 for the set. There's a fair amount of them out there.
Some of the chapters look very similar to the kinds of topics that one would find in more systematic philosophical treatments. Is he actually doing philosophy in these things? Is he thinking systematically the way a philosopher would in these, for example, on the substance of humanity and of what it is composed, and there were a couple of others that struck my mind as, this looks like a chapter I might find in Locke, for example.
It would be interesting. He doesn't specifically mention Locke, and it would be interesting to know in a little more detail who he read besides the ones he quotes. Clearly, he was not trained as a philosopher, and he's far from being a philosopher like Kant, although he is aware of Kant, right? He's a philosopher in the sense that he's trying to express, as he said, his sensations, his sentiments closer to Montaigne than anything else.
So-
Montaigne is not a
Yeah, yeah.
Platonic philosopher.
Yeah.
He's somebody who philosophizes
Yeah.
by himself.
Okay, I think I understand.
Yeah, you wouldn't find him in the history of systematic philosophy. It's not it's not Bertrand Russell or something like that, or even Schopenhauer. But it is a fascinating thinking, I think. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to put together, where you were mentioning right at the beginning when we were talking formally before the class, the very strong class distinctions that played up through comic opera, that were projected in comic opera, that go away in some abstract sense with the revolution. And the fact that as a professional musician, a family of musicians, he was in a lower strata class. Is the turn away from opera after the revolution, and the turn towards philosophy of a sort, is that partly his rejecting, I think you alluded to or said correctly, that he didn't like the turn opera had taken after the revolution, which I assume is rescue operas and less comic opera. And is it partly that? Is it partly that he was now free to do something other than music because of the revolution? Or is it some mixture of the two?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. One of the things he says in some detail is that there was a social gulf between writers, whom he said were always referred to as Monsieur de Marmontel, Monsieur de Beaumarchais, Monsieur de something or other, indicating social standing, and all the other artists. He clearly considers the writers to be artists, but there's a gulf between them at a higher level and people who are sculptors, painters, musicians, performing artists, who do not get the respect and the social standing of the people who are writers. You could think, he's wealthy, now he has the leisure in order to move up to the next social level, which is funny because it happens precisely